Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment and letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. The Dollhouse Murders. A chilling tale of miniature terror. Blackwood Manor, December 12, 1953. The first officer to enter the mansion vomited on his polished shoes. 200 glass eyes gleamed in the flickering gaslight as Detective William Hargrove stepped into the parlor. Antique dolls surrounded the body of Evelyn Blackwood, the reclusive textile heiress, arranged in a perfect circle. Their porcelain faces were tilted upward, as if watching the scene unfold from the ceiling. Evelyn sat slumped in her favorite armchair, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. Around her throat a miniature noose made of braided silk thread. But the true horror lay in the dolls' mouths. The teeth. Forensic examiner Dr. Lillian Cross adjusted her gloves as she pried open the first doll's jaw. "Dear God," she whispered. Each doll contained a single human molar, meticulously glued to its porcelain palate. Some were yellowed with age, others still pink at the roots. When the team catalogued them, they found teeth from at least 47 different individuals. The most disturbing discovery came when they examined the doll at Evelyn's feet, a perfect replica of the heiress as a child, complete with emerald green eyes and auburn ringlets. Its tiny noose matched the one around Evelyn's neck. Inside its mouth, a freshly extracted wisdom tooth. The moving dolls. Officer Jenkins was the first to notice. "Detective," he said, voice tight. "The French-made doll was by the window before." Hargrove turned. Now the doll with the lace cap stood directly behind Evelyn's chair, its hand outstretched as if stroking her hair. Over the next 3 days, the team documented impossible changes. A Victorian bride doll that appeared inches closer each time someone blinked. A sailor boy whose head slowly rotated to follow movement. The faint scent of lavender and formaldehyde that grew stronger near certain dolls. The final straw came when crime scene photographer Daniel Marsh developed his film. In every picture, the dolls' expressions had changed, their painted smiles now grotesque, open-mouthed leers. The journal. They found it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the nursery, Evelyn's personal diary, its pages brittle with age. The entries began normally enough: records of tea parties, doll auctions, charitable work. Then, in 1947, the tone shifted. March 3rd, the voices started again last night. "They're coming from the doll cabinet. Little Margaret says they want teeth now. She says they're hungry." April 17th, "I found Mrs. Wentworth's missing dentures in the Dresden doll's mouth. I don't remember putting them there." The final entry, dated the night before her death. "They promised to let me join them if I give one last gift. Little Margaret says it has to be mine. The dentist comes tomorrow at noon." The revelation. Research uncovered that Evelyn had been institutionalized briefly in 1936, following the disappearance of her childhood nanny. The woman's body was never found. But when detectives excavated the mansion's gardens, they uncovered a small cedar box buried beneath the rose bushes. Inside, a child's molar wrapped in 1920s newspaper. A lock of auburn hair matching Evelyn's. A tiny noose identical to the murder weapon. Most chilling of all, the box contained 47 miniature name tags, each corresponding to a former Blackwood Manor servant who had quit abruptly over the past 3 decades. The final night. The case was officially closed as an unsolved death. But on the evening the dolls were to be catalogued as evidence, a terrible scream echoed through the precinct basement. When officers arrived, they found every evidence locker flung open. The dolls arranged in a perfect circle. Officer Jenkins kneeling in the center, his mouth forced into a rictus grin. Most horrifying of all, his perfect teeth were missing, and in his hands, he clutched two tiny porcelain jaws that now clicked together rhythmically, like a child laughing. Epilogue. Today, Blackwood Manor stands empty. But neighbors swear that on foggy nights, the dolls can be seen watching from the windows, their smiles a little wider, their glass eyes a little brighter. And if you press your ear to the mansion's walls, you can just make out the sound of something small and sharp being dragged across porcelain. Story 2. The Vanishing Village. The snowmobile's engine coughed to silence as Corporal Danvers squinted through the swirling Arctic haze. Before him lay Angakok, or what remained of it. 30 igloos and wooden cabins stood perfectly intact beneath the pale morning sun. Smoke still curled from chimney pipes. A pot of caribou stew sat frozen on a stove, one wooden spoon sticking straight up in the thickening broth. But not a single soul stirred in the settlement. Danvers' boot crunched through the ice-crusted snow as he approached the first dwelling. His breath came in short, nervous puffs. The Canadian government had sent him to investigate why radio contact had ceased with the remote Inuit village 2 weeks prior. Now he understood why his Inuit guide had refused to come beyond the last ridge. "Hello," Danvers called out, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. Only the whine of the wind answered. Inside the first cabin, a half-mended sealskin parka lay draped across a chair, bone needle still threaded. A hunting rifle leaned against the wall, fully loaded. On the table sat 4 bowls of untouched akuduk, the Inuit berry dessert still moist, as if prepared minutes before his arrival. Danvers' gloved hand trembled as he lifted the radio to his lips. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've reached Angakok. There's no one here." Then he saw the dogs. 12 sled dogs, normally loud, snapping beasts, lay dead in their harnesses, still chained to posts. Their frozen tongues protruded from muzzles locked in silent snarls. Not a mark on them. Just empty. As if something had sucked the life right out. The grave. It was young Inuk guide Nukulik who found it, despite his terror. "Corporal," he whispered, pointing with shaking mittens. "Over there." At the village's edge, the permafrost had been excavated in a perfect rectangle 20 feet long, 10 feet wide. A mass grave dug with military precision. Danvers' stomach turned as he approached. The grave was empty. No bodies. No blood. Just smooth, icy walls that reflected their frightened faces back at them. Strangest of all, the excavation showed no tool marks. The walls were polished smooth, as if melted by tremendous heat. "This was made before they vanished," Nukulik breathed. "Look, no snow inside. Dug recently." Danvers radioed for backup. Then night fell. The voices. The temperature plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Inside the radio cabin, Danvers and Nukulik huddled around a crackling shortwave set, jumping at every creak of the settling village. Then at exactly 3:17 a.m. the radio burst to life. "Help us!" a woman's voice whispered through the static. Danvers lunged for the receiver. "This is RCMP Corporal Danvers." "Who is this?" More voices joined, men, women, children, all speaking in Inuktitut, their words overlapping in a desperate chorus. "They took us. So cold down here. The lights, the beautiful lights." Nukulik turned ashen. "That's Elder Katuk's voice." And little Apat's laughter. Then came the sound that still haunts official records, a wet, crunching noise like ice collapsing under immense pressure, followed by a scream so piercing the radio speaker blew out. When the RCMP reinforcements arrived at dawn, they found the radio cabin door ripped from its hinges. Danvers' parka lay neatly folded on his cot, frost glittering on the fur trim. Of Nukulik, only a single mitten remained, fingers still inside. And the mass grave? Filled overnight with fresh, unmarked snow. Epilogue. The official report listed unknown natural phenomena as the cause. The settlement was bulldozed in 1961. But Inuit hunters still avoid that valley. They say if you listen when the aurora dances particularly bright, you can hear voices singing beneath the ice. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, the snow drifts into strange, perfect rectangles. Story 3. The Boy Who Wasn't There. Stockholm, Sweden, November 1937. The woman's screams woke the entire apartment building at 3:42 a.m. Police Constable Lundqvist found Elsa Westerberg clawing at her own face in the nursery, her nightgown drenched in sweat. "He's gone. They took my Emil," she shrieked, pointing to an empty bed still warm to the touch. A child's pajamas lay neatly folded on the pillow. The investigation began normally enough. Officers searched the building. Neighbors formed search parties. Posters went up across Stockholm featuring Emil's description: 6 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing red pajamas with white rabbits. Then the inconsistencies started piling up. The school that never knew him. Headmaster Bergstrom of the local primary school adjusted his spectacles as he flipped through enrollment records. "I'm sorry, Constable, but we've never had an Emil Westerberg. Not last year, not this year." The teacher allegedly assigned to Emil's class, Fru Lindgren, went pale when shown his photograph. "That's impossible. I remember this boy, but not in my classroom. In my dreams. Always standing at the foot of my bed, counting his fingers." She abruptly excused herself. Later, Lundqvist would note she'd been trembling so badly she left fingerprints in the wood of her desk. The neighbor's testimony. Fru Andersson from apartment 4B wrung her hands. "Elsa always walked alone. Carried groceries alone. I never saw a child with her, not once in 6 years." Herr Johansson, the building superintendent, was more blunt. "She'd talk to empty air on the stairs. Once I caught her setting 2 places at her kitchen table, humming to nobody." When pressed, every tenant admitted the same thing: they'd heard a child's laughter in Elsa's apartment, but never actually seen Emil. The photographs. The evidence box smelled of developing chemicals and something faintly rotten. Detective Inspector Thorin spread the family photos across his desk. "Notice anything peculiar?" he asked Lundqvist. In every picture, Emil appeared slightly blurred compared to his surroundings. His face never fully in focus. And in the rare shots where his hands were visible. "Jesus Christ," Lundqvist breathed. The boy had 7 fingers on each hand. The diary. They found it buried beneath floorboards in Elsa's closet, its leather cover warped as if repeatedly exposed to moisture. The first entry was dated exactly 6 years earlier. March 15, 1931. Day 1 of pretending he exists. The doctors say it will help. I've named him Emil, after my brother who drowned. I bought him a stuffed bear today. When I hold it, I can almost feel his weight in my arms. The entries grew more disturbing. April 3, 1931. Emil spoke today. He said "Mama" when I gave him his milk. The sound came from the walls. I'm so proud. December 24, 1934. He asked about Father Christmas. I explained he wouldn't come because we've been naughty. Emil got angry. The mirrors fogged up and I smelled wet wool. When it cleared, all my reflections' teeth were missing. The final entry was dated the night before Emil's disappearance. November 17, 1937. He knows I've stopped believing. The pretending isn't working anymore. Tonight he showed me his real face in the nursery window. There were so many teeth. He says if I tell anyone, he'll make the whole building forget me too. The disappearance. Elsa Westerberg vanished 3 days after the diary's discovery. Her apartment was found locked from the inside, a half-drunk cup of tea still warm on the table. The nursery window stood open despite the freezing temperatures. On Emil's bed lay 7 tiny finger bones arranged in a smiling mouth. The official report listed it as a mental breakdown with probable suicide. The case was closed. But Lundqvist kept one piece of evidence, a photograph not entered into the record. It showed Elsa standing in a park, her shadow stretching unnaturally long behind her. If you looked closely at the shadow's silhouette, you could make out the shape of small hand clutching hers. And if you held the photo to your ear at night, some claimed you could hear faint, wet whispering. Mama forgot the rules. Now I get to play with everyone. Story 4. The Laughing Death. New Orleans, 1962, Preservation Hall. The sticky summer air clung to the packed crowd as King Bolden's brass band took the stage for their midnight set. The scent of sweat, whiskey, and something faintly metallic like a wet copper penny hung over the room. Trumpet player Lucien King Bolden flashed the crowd his gold-capped smile, but his bandmates noticed how his fingers trembled as he poured dark powder from a vial into their shared whiskey bottle. "Special blend, boys," he whispered. "Gonna make us play like angels tonight." The performance. The first set was transcendent. Saxophonist Charlie Bird LeBlanc hit notes so pure women wept into their handkerchiefs. Drummer Big Joe Baptiste's hands became a blur, his rhythm syncopating with the very pulse of the audience. Then, during St. James Infirmary, the changes started. Pianist Antoine Dumont began giggling mid-solo, his fingers spider-walking across the keys in impossible contortions. Bassist Silas Greer dropped his instrument to claw at his own face, laughing as strips of skin peeled away beneath his nails. The audience cheered, thinking it part of the act. The tape. What survives is the trial recording now kept in a lead-lined vault at Tulane University. The first 20 minutes showcase the greatest jazz performance ever captured. Then, 21 minutes and 34 seconds, a wet crunching sound as Silas' jaw unhinges, his laughter now a bubbling shriek. 27 minutes and 12 seconds, Bird LeBlanc's saxophone spewing black fluid, his cheeks inflating like balloons until they burst. 33 minutes and 45 seconds, the moment the trumpet section's laughter synchronizes into a single, multitonal voice screaming "Make it stop" in perfect harmony. The trial. Bolden sat perfectly composed in court, his polished shoes tapping along to the recording. When the prosecutor demanded to know why, he simply smiled. "They heard the music behind the music," he said. "The real song the universe hums when it thinks we ain't listening." As bailiffs restrained weeping jurors, Bolden leaned into the microphone, "Y'all hearing it now too, and shot." The aftermath. The courthouse janitor found the evidence room flooded with brackish water the next morning. The tape reel had dissolved into a gelatinous mass that when examined under microscope showed faintly pulsating strands resembling human vocal cords. 5 court reporters who transcribed the trial were committed to East Louisiana State Hospital. All maintained they could still hear the band playing in the walls. Their final coherent words, recorded in their charts, were identical. "The laughing's coming from inside my bones." Epilogue. Today, Preservation Hall hosts an annual Bolden Memorial Jam. Old-timers swear that if you sit in the back left corner during the second set, you'll feel something warm and wet drip into your drink. And if you're foolish enough to drink it? Well, let's just say the band's always looking for new members. Story 5. The Silent Children of Black Hollow. The first little girl went missing on a Tuesday evening, just as the Fireflies began their twilight dance. Maggie Whitaker, age 7 with cornflower blue ribbons in her hair, had skipped out to the mailbox to post a letter to her grandmother. Her mother Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Maggie's white pinafore disappeared around the lilac bush. 30 seconds later, when Sarah called her to supper, only silence answered. They found Maggie's doll, Baby Ann, perched neatly on the mailbox, its normally cheerful porcelain face split by a jagged crack. When Sheriff Dawson turned the doll over, something rattled inside. The seam along its back had been carefully unstitched and resewn with black thread. Inside its cotton-stuffed belly, nestled among the stuffing, lay a small human molar still flecked with blood. The second disappearance came exactly 1 week later, as the church bells tolled 8 o'clock. Timmy Branson had been catching fireflies in a mason jar behind his family's farmhouse. His mother Martha heard him whooping with delight, then a strange giggle that raised the hairs on her neck, too high, too musical, like silverware tinkling against glass. By the time she reached the backyard, only Timmy's jar remained, its lid screwed tight. The fireflies inside had all been crushed, their bioluminescent guts smearing the glass like phosphorescent paint. Timmy's overalls were found folded with military precision on the porch swing, the cuffs turned up just how he hated them. In each pocket rested a small white tooth, 20 in total, some still with shreds of gum tissue clinging to the roots. By the third week, Black Hollow had become a town of locked doors and loaded rifles. Reverend Cole preached about the mark of Cain at Sunday service, his fist pounding the pulpit hard enough to shake the stained glass windows. Old Nan Pritchett took to leaving bowls of cream and iron nails on her stoop, muttering about the kindly ones, things that wore children's faces like ill-fitting masks. Then came the harvest moon. 11 sets of parents woke simultaneously at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of fingernails dragging down their front doors. When they opened them, their missing children stood on the welcome mats, almost their children. Maggie's cornflower ribbons now looked more like veins dried blue. Timmy's freckles had rearranged themselves into strange constellations. All of them smiled with teeth too white, too numerous, their canines just slightly pointed. And their eyes. Deputy Wilkins would later swear in his official report that when he shined his lantern on the returned children, their pupils contracted vertically like cat's eyes. "We brought friends home from the woods," they chorused, voices harmonizing unnaturally. Behind them, the moonlight revealed dozens of pale, slender figures swaying in the shadows at the tree line. Some stood barely waist-high, others nearly adult-sized, all with that same terrible smile. Their fingers twitched in unison, nails clicking together like cicada wings. What happened next depends on who you ask. The Grahams swore they slammed their door so hard the hinges bent. The Millers claimed they fell to their knees weeping, gathering their not-quite child clothes until dawn revealed they held only a bundle of sticks and rotting milkweed. But old Nan Pritchett? She'll fix you with her one good eye and tell the truth everyone knows but won't speak aloud. The real children never came back at all. What walks around wearing their skin just ain't been taught how to cry proper yet. Now we nail horseshoes upside down above every cradle in Black Hollow. Now we burn the baby teeth the tooth fairy collects. And when August heat makes the fireflies dance thick as stars, we pull our living children inside before dark and pretend not to hear the giggles echoing from the black hollows between the trees, or see the small, pale hands that sometimes wave at us from the cornfields at dusk. Inspired by the 1909 disappearance of 5 children in Fayetteville, West Virginia and Appalachian Fay folklore. Story 6. The Sleepwalking Assassin. A Haunting Tale of War and Madness. October 17, 1947, 3:17 a.m. The gunshot woke the entire neighborhood. When police burst into the modest Queens apartment, they found Captain Thomas Iron Tom Callahan standing at attention in his dress uniform, his service revolver still smoking. His wife Margaret lay sprawled across their bed, a single bullet hole between her wide, unblinking eyes. "I was following orders, sir," Callahan said to the empty corner of the room, snapping a crisp salute as officers tackled him. The trial that shook a nation. The courtroom buzzed with horrified whispers as the decorated war hero repeated his chilling defense. Colonel Chambers gave the order directly. "Neutralize the target." "I've never disobeyed a direct order, Your Honor." The problem? Colonel James Chambers had died on Omaha Beach 3 years earlier, blown apart by German artillery while Callahan watched helplessly from 50 yards away. Prosecutor Edwin Shaw brandished the autopsy photos. "Then who gave you this order, Captain?" Callahan's face went slack. His right hand twitched in a perfect mimicry of Chambers' nervous pre-battle tic. When he spoke again, his voice dropped an octave matching the colonel's distinctive Kentucky drawl. "The war never ends, son. We just change battlefields." The cell block phenomenon. Sing Sing's guards kept meticulous logs of Callahan's disturbing behavior. November 3, inmate observed saluting empty cell corner for 47 minutes. November 17, loud argument heard in cell. Only voice recorded was Callahan's alternating between his normal tone and officer voice. December 1, guard swears he saw shadow of a man in WW2 officer's uniform standing behind Callahan during head count. Most chilling was the night of December 19, when Callahan's cell went silent at exactly 2:13 a.m. The guard who investigated found the bunk made with military precision. Callahan's pillowcase stuffed with dirt from Omaha Beach, verified by forensic geologists. A perfect bullet hole through the cell wall, though no weapon was found. The breakthrough. Dr. Eleanor West, the prison psychiatrist, made a horrifying discovery in Callahan's service records. On D-Day, he'd been temporarily declared dead after the artillery strike that killed Chambers. His resurrection after 8 minutes in a body bag had been considered miraculous. But what if something else came back in that uniform? Drive West wrote in her final, redacted notes. The men who served with him described Chambers as the kind of officer who'd chase his troops into hell just to keep fighting. Now I wonder, did he? The disappearance. On the anniversary of Chambers' death, guards found Callahan's cell empty. The security footage showed him walking through 3 locked doors, each opening before he touched them. The final frame captured his back disappearing into swirling fog that shouldn't have existed in the indoor corridor. On the cell floor, they found a perfect set of dog tags belonging to James Chambers. 1944 French soil in the boot prints. The distinct smell of gunpowder and rotting seaweed. Epilogue. To this day, veterans of the 116th Infantry swear they sometimes see 2 figures patrolling Omaha Beach at low tide, one marching stiffly, the other barking orders only they can hear. And if you listen closely to the static between channels on military radios, you might just catch a familiar drawl whispering. The war goes on. Find your next target. Story 7. The Sleepwalking Assassin. A true crime horror story. October 29, 1947, 2:47 a.m. The neighbors first smelled gunpowder. When NYPD officers kicked down the door of the modest Queens apartment, they found Captain Thomas Iron Tom Callahan standing at parade rest in full dress uniform, his Colt M1911 still warm. His wife Margaret lay across their bed in a nightgown, one perfect hole between her eyes, a kill shot only a trained marksman could make. "I was following orders, sir," Callahan told the empty corner of the bedroom, snapping a salute so sharp it cut the air. The trial that broke the bailiff. The courtroom gasped when the prosecution revealed their key piece of evidence, Margaret's diary, found buried in a flour tin. October 12, Tom woke screaming about the beach again. Said Chambers was in our closet. When I looked, all I saw was his old uniform moving like someone was inside it. The defense psychiatrist diagnosed combat fatigue. The prosecutor pointed to Callahan's spotless service record and the chilling precision of the murder. Then Callahan took the stand. For 3 hours, he answered in his own voice. Then, when shown a photo of Colonel James Chambers, his commanding officer killed at Normandy, his spine straightened unnaturally. His right eye developed Chambers' distinctive twitch. The voice that emerged wasn't his. Private Callahan followed orders like a good soldier. Always did. Even when I told him to put 3 in that German boy's chest after he surrendered. A bailiff fainted. The court stenographer later quit her job, claiming her transcripts kept changing overnight, adding paragraphs in handwriting matching Chambers' lost letters. The cell that held 2 prisoners. Sing Sing's night guards kept a secret log. November 3, inmate stands at attention from 2300 to 0600, whispering battle coordinates. November 11, Smell of seawater and cordite in cell. Walls damp to touch. November 19, 2 voices clearly arguing, I won't do it again. / that's an order, soldier. Most disturbing was the December 1st entry. Found Callahan's mattress flipped. Underneath, 47 perfect bullet holes forming Omaha Beach coastline. Sand in each one. Inmate claims the colonel's making me practice. The breakthrough that vanished. Dr. Llewellyn, the prison psychiatrist, made 3 notes before his disappearance. Callahan's pupils dilated differently when Chambers spoke. The inmate could recite verbatim conversations no one else heard. His cell temperature dropped exactly 11 degrees, the same as D-Day morning. The doctor's final journal entry. Asked about the new mission. Callahan smiled with only half his face. Said the colonel needs a platoon. Then all my pens started writing by themselves. The empty cell. On June 6, 1948, D-Day's anniversary, guards found the bed made with hospital corners. Callahan's uniform folded with a purple heart inside. The walls covered in fresh saltwater stains. One sentence scratched into the floor, Ora semper fi, Callahan was Army. The security footage showed the cell door opening at 2:13 a.m. A shadowy figure in an officer's cap stepped inside. Then static. Epilogue. These facts remain. 17 veterans from Callahan's unit committed suicide by 1950. A 1993 forensic team found Normandy sand in the apartment walls. Margaret's grave exudes the smell of gun oil every October 29. And if you listen to old military radios at 2:47 a.m., you might hear 2 voices whispering. Ready for next orders, sir. Attaboy, Private. We got all eternity to fight this war. Story 8. The Polaroid Stalker. A found footage nightmare. September 14, 1988, 3:33 a.m. The click of her front door lock woke Jennifer Morrow. Her studio apartment was empty, the chain lock still secured. Then she saw a Polaroid photo slipped under her fridge, still reeking of developing chemicals. The image showed her sleeping in her current bed, wearing the same pajamas. Scrawled on the white border in red ink, 9/13/88, Sweet Dreams. The problem? Jennifer had moved in on September 14. The investigation that went digital. Detective Mark Vasquez found the pattern quickly. Each victim received a Polaroid showing them sleeping. Photos were always dated 1 day before they moved in. Exactly 7 days later, they vanished without a trace. The box of evidence held 23 photos spanning 1979 to 1988. All showed the same disturbing details. Victims' eyes were always open in the shots, though they swore they'd been asleep. A faint shadow loomed just outside each frame. The red ink smelled faintly of copper and rotten eggs. Then on October 21, 2023, Vasquez's daughter found a TikTok trend. #Polaroid Challenge, teens recreating the original crime scene photos. The comments section was worse. Asterisk at Shadow Watcher 42, LOL, these posers don't even get the dates right. The real ones are on darknet/stocksnap asterisk. The modern twist. Cybercrimes found the forum. The most active thread. Timeless collection, updated. Posted every Friday at 3:33 a.m. EST. 1988 victim Jennifer Morrow, now aged 57, standing in what looks like her original apartment. 1992 victim David Chen as a 12-year-old, he disappeared at 28. All wearing the same clothes from their original photos. Most chilling? The metadata showed current timestamps. The final clue. Vasquez's team missed it until the 47th viewing in every photo's reflection. A vintage Polaroid Sun 600 camera. Held by a figure with no reflection. The lens always focused just beyond the frame. On the morning Vasquez planned to raid the server host, his wife found a new Polaroid on their fridge. Their 8-year-old daughter, sleeping. Dated yesterday. The red ink this time read: "Smile, you're next." Epilogue. The Darknet forum remains active. New photos appear weekly. And if you check the metadata, the next upload is always scheduled for exactly 7 days after your birthday. Story 9. The Suicide-Packed Town. A chilling tale of mass hysteria. November 1, 1929, Red Oak, Oklahoma. Sheriff Eli Harding would never forget the creak of rope against wood. 7 bodies swayed in the dawn light from the church rafters, the schoolhouse bell tower, even the old Miller boys' treehouse. Each face frozen in the same wide-eyed terror, tongues black and swollen. Each noose tied with identical 13 coils. But it was the notes that sent ice through Harding's veins. Scrawled on scraps of paper, tucked in pockets, nailed to doors, all bearing the same 6 words. "He's wearing my face now." The survivor. They found little Mary Beth Harlow at the edge of Widow's Creek, her cornflower blue dress soaked with dew. The 4-year-old clutched a rag doll with button eyes, its stuffing leaking long strands of auburn hair later matched to schoolteacher Abigail Graves, who swung from the church steeple. Mary Beth wouldn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, her voice was all wrong, too deep, too smooth, like creek water over stones. "Mr. Pritchett, let them out," she whispered. "The ones who live behind the mirrors." The investigation. The coroner's report noted impossible details. Every victim's pupils were mirrored, reflecting things not in the room. Their teeth had been replaced with jagged shards of glass. A sweet, cloying smell of honeysuckle clung to their clothes. Then there were the photographs. Town clerk Walter Higgins had documented the scene with his Kodak. When developed, every shot showed the victim's eyes open and staring directly at the camera. A blurred figure standing just behind each body. The same face repeated 7 times. The dark history. Research uncovered Red Oak's founding legend, the 1889 Pritchett incident. As the story went, Elias Pritchett had built the town's first barbershop with an unusual feature, a wall of mirrors salvaged from a traveling circus. Folks started seeing double, read a yellowed newspaper clipping. Then one morning, they found Pritchett scraping his own face off with a straight razor. Kept screaming, "He's in the glass." The barbershop burned down in 1892. The ground refused to grow grass afterward. The final revelation. On November 5, Sheriff Harding opened Mary Beth's doll. Inside, nestled among the hair and cotton batting, he found 7 tiny nooses made of braided thread. A shard of mirror etched with the Pritchett nom. A child's fingernail painted with the date 11/1/29. That night, Harding's deputy reported hearing the sheriff arguing with someone in his office. When he investigated, he found the walls covered in handprints made of honeysuckle sap. Every mirror shattered outward. Harding's service revolver still warm. Of the sheriff, only his badge remained pinned to a grinning scarecrow propped in his chair. Epilogue. Red Oak became a ghost town by 1935. But travelers on Route 9 swear that if you stop near the old barbershop site at dusk, you'll see 7 shadows moving behind broken windows. The sweet stink of honeysuckle on the wind. Your own face smiling back from puddles just a little too wide. And if you listen closely, you'll hear Mary Beth's doll still whispering. "Knock knock. Who's there?" "Just me wearing your face now." Story 10. The Blood Type Kill. A chilling true crime horror story. October 1974, St. Louis, Missouri. The first body was found in a derelict church basement, completely exsanguinated, WTH 2 precise puncture wounds at the jugular. No blood at the scene. No fingerprints. Just a single playing card left on the victim's chest, the Ace of Hearts, with the words Type A+ written in what later tested to be human blood. By the third victim, a pattern emerged. The impossible forensic. Detective Sarah Whitman stared at the lab report in disbelief. "You're telling me the blood pooled under the victims? Isn't theirs?" the coroner finished. "This is AB negative. Victim was O positive. And before you ask, no, it's not the killer's either. This blood is at least 50 years old. Each crime scene contained the same disturbing signature. Victims drained via surgical incisions. 1 to 2 liters of foreign blood left at the scene. Playing cards noting blood types that never matched. The vials. The break came when a janitor found a hidden compartment in an abandoned hospital. Inside, 47 glass vials labeled with names and dates, 1892 to 1974. Half contained dark, coagulated blood. The other half were empty, including ones labeled Whitman, S. and Loomis, J. Sarah's partner. Most chilling was the ledger. Asterisk harvest, June 18, 74 ONEG, Miller. Infusion, June 19, 74, B. Self. Balance, minus 1.2 liters asterisk. The revelation. Professor James Loomis, Sarah's father figure and retired hematologist, went pale when shown the vials. "These dates, this handwriting, it's impossible." He pointed to a 1932 vial. "This is my grandfather's work. He believed blood held memories. That transfusions could transfer more than just cells." That night, Loomis disappeared. They found his body in the hospital morgue drained, with 2 vials in his hands, one empty, one full. The note read, "He's remembering himself through us." The final showdown. Sarah tracked the killer to the hospital's original 1892 wing. In the ancient operating theater, she found walls covered in transfusion equations. A surgical table with restraints. Every missing vial arranged in a spiral. The figure that emerged from the shadows wore Dr. Loomis' face, but his eyes were all wrong. Black. Shiny. Like a shark's. "Sarah," it said in Loomis' voice. "Your type of negative. The rarest. His favorite." When it smiled, she saw the teeth needle sharp, hollow. Epilogue. They found Sarah's service weapon with an empty clip. The walls were painted in a strange mixture of their blood types. The last vial was gone. Now, every few years, another body appears, always drained, always with a new ace of hearts. The blood left behind gets older each time. And if you check the cold case files, the handwriting on the cards is changing. Looking more like Sarah's every year. Story 11. The Ghost Ship Herders. A Nautical Nightmare. March 18, 1902, Halifax Harbor. The Mary Celeste had nothing on the Harbinger. When the 3-mast schooner drifted into port with no one at her helm, Harbor Master Eliason knew something was wrong before he even boarded. The sails hung slack, yet the ship moved steadily against the tide. The rigging creaked a funeral dirge. And the smell, God, the smell like low tide at a slaughterhouse. The log of Captain Jeremiah Voss. Shaw found a leather-bound journal in the captain's quarters, its final pages stuck together with something dark and tacky. The last legible entry. Asterisk March 10, discovered 3 stowaways in cargo hold. Not on manifest. Not human. Their skin, it moved like water over rocks. First Mate Garrick put a bullet in one's head. The hole closed before the smoke cleared. Asterisk. The entries grew frantic. Asterisk March 12, crew disappearing. Strange knocking in the walls. Cook says the biscuit tin refills itself each night with something that looks like hardtack. Asterisk. Asterisk March 14, it's mimicking us. Found what looked like Garrick in the FOCSLE. His face, it slid right off when I touched him. The real Garrick's teeth turned up in the stew pot. Asterisk. The final entry, scrawled in what the coroner would later confirm was human bile. It's in the walls now. It learned to knock. God help whoever finds this ship. The last word was an ink blot shaped disturbingly like a screaming face. The impossible evidence. The search party found every hammock neatly made, as if crew had simply evaporated. The ship's bell stuffed with what looked like human hair. A lifeboat containing 7 left shoes, all right feet. The galley stocked with fresh meat, though the ship had been at sea for months. Most disturbing was the cargo hold. The manifest listed only cotton and molasses, but investigators found 13 barrels of black brine that moved against gravity when unobserved. A child's porcelain doll with real teeth sewn into its gums. The ship's cat, perfectly preserved in a block of salt, still purring. The survivor that wasn't. 3 days after the discovery, a figure washed ashore at Peggy's Cove. At first, rescuers thought it was crewman Charlie Driscoll until they got close. His skin was wrong. Too smooth. His mouth opened only to emit a sound like a foghorn mimicked by human vocal cords. When the doctor touched his wrist, the flesh parted like curtains, revealing hollow space where bones should be. The thing that wasn't Charlie lasted 6 hours in custody. Its final words, spoken in perfect unison by 5 guards who'd been nowhere near it. "We're still sailing." Then it dissolved into a black slick that ate through the jail cell floor. Epilogue. The Harbinger burned mysteriously in dry dock 2 weeks later. The fire turned steel to slag yet left nearby paper untouched. To this day, sailors report radio calls from ships that vanished decades ago. Knock patterns matching the Harbinger's hull number. Crews found with their shoes on the wrong feet. And if you listen closely during a storm at sea, you might hear 3 rapid knocks, followed by 4 more from inside your ship's walls. Story 12. Title: The Mirror Confession. A psychological horror story. Genre: horror/psychological thriller. Word count: 10,000 plus. Setting: modern day, police station and asylum. Act 1, The Arrest. Int. Police interrogation room, night. Asterisk: a single flickering fluorescent light hums above a metal table. Detective James Carter, mid-40s, hardened by years of homicide cases, sits across from Lillian Voss, early 30s, her hands cuffed, her eyes hollow. A mirror spans the wall behind her. Asterisk. Detective Carter. Flipping through case file. Lillian, let's go over this one more time. You admit you shot your husband. Lillian. Whispering, eyes locked on the mirror. I didn't pull the trigger. She did. Carter. She. Lillian. Leans forward, desperate. My reflection. She's been talking to me for weeks. Telling me things, terrible things. Carter exhales, rubbing his temples. His partner, Detective Maria Rivera, watches through the two-way glass, arms crossed. Rivera, VO. Into radio. She's either insane or playing us. Carter. Skeptical. Your reflection told you to kill him. Lillian. Nods, trembling. She said, he wasn't really my husband. That something was wearing his face. A long silence. Carter glances at the mirror. For a split second his reflection doesn't move with him. Act 2, The Cell. Int. Police holding cell, later. Lillian sits on the cot, knees to her chest, staring at the stainless steel mirror bolted to the wall. The camera feed glitches slightly. Security footage, black and white. Lillian suddenly stands, approaching the mirror. She presses her palm against it. Lillian. Whispering. What do you want? A beat. Then a voice, distorted, whispers back. Reflection, distorted. Not Lillian's voice. You know what comes next. Lillian's reflection grins too wide, teeth sharpening. The real Lillian screams. Guard, OS. Banging on bars. Hey. Shut it down in there. The reflection snaps back to normal. Lillian collapses, sobbing. Act 3, the truth unfolds. Hint. Police station, next morning. Rivera reviews the footage, freezing on the reflection's grin. Her coffee goes cold. Technician. Nervous. We didn't alter this. That's raw feed. Carter digs into Lillian's past. Finds a childhood incident, a mirror game where she claimed her reflection stayed behind. Flashback, Lillian's childhood bathroom. Young Lillian covers the mirror, chanting. Young Lillian. Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who's the realest one of all? When she uncovers it, her reflection is still covering its eyes. Act 4, the final confession. Hint. Interrogation room, night. Lillian is catatonic, rocking back and forth. Carter leans in. Carter. Lillian. What did it say to you? Exactly. Her head snaps up. Her voice is no longer her own. Lillian, demonic. You'll see soon enough. Behind Carter, the mirror cracks. Blood seeps from the fractures, forming words. Written in blood. Your turn. Carter's reflection steps out of the mirror. Fade to black. Screams. Epilogue. Hint. Psychiatric ward, present day. Rivera visits Lillian, now strapped to a bed. The room has no mirrors. Rivera. Lillian. Carter's missing. Lillian smiles, eyes black. Lillian. Whispers. No, he's not. He's right behind you. Rivera turns. The wall is polished steel. Her reflection waves at her with Carter's severed hand. Roll credits. Story 13. The woman in the case. On a sultry August afternoon in 1903, a dapper, if somewhat anemic, young man entered the Broadway store of Rogers, Peet and Company, in New York City, and asked to be allowed to look at a suit of clothes. Having selected one to his fancy and arranged for some alterations, he produced from his wallet a check for $280, drawn to the order of George B. Lang, and signed E. Bierstadt, and remarked to the attentive salesman, I haven't got quite enough cash with me to pay for these, but I have been intending to cash this check all the afternoon. Of course, you don't know me or even that my name is Lang, but if you will forward the check to the bank, they will certify it, and tomorrow I will send for the suit and the balance of the money. Certainly, Mr. Lang, replied the salesman. I will hold the suit and the money to await your orders. The customer thanked him and took his departure. The check was sent to the bank certified it, then cancelled its certification and returned the check to Rogers, Peet and Company, and the store detectives, having communicated with police headquarters, anxiously awaited the arrival of Mr. Lang's messenger. Fig 1 envelope on the back of which Parker's forged order was written. Fig 1 envelope on the back of which Parker's forged order was written. Their efforts were rewarded a couple of days later by the appearance at the store of a lad who presented a written order, Fig 1 and Fig 2, inscribed upon the back of an envelope bearing a cancelled stamp and addressed to G.O.B. Lang, number 13. West 26th Street, New York City, which read as follows. Rogers, Peet & Co. Please give to bearer the clothes I purchased on Tuesday, suit pants S coat. And also kindly put change in envelope in inside coat pocket. Trusting the alterations are satisfactory, and thanking you in advance for the favor and for past courtesies, I am RESP yours. G.O.B. Lang. Fig 2 Parker's order on Rogers, Pete and Company, in the name of Lang. Fig. 2 Parker's order on Rogers, Pete and Company, in the name of Lang. The boy was immediately placed under arrest, and after proclaiming his own innocence and vociferating that he was only doing an errand for a gent, who was waiting close by, was directed to return with his bundle as if nothing had occurred. This he did, and Mr. George B. Lang was soon in the clutches of the law. Interrogated by his captors, the supposed Lang admitted that his real name was James Parker, that he lived at 110 West 38th Street, and only requested that his wife be immediately notified of what had happened. At headquarters, the prisoner was identified as a gentleman who had been very actively engaged during the preceding months in passing bad checks throughout the city, his more recent operations having consisted in cashing a check on the Lincoln National Bank for $160 on July 20th, one for $290 on the same bank on July 30th, still another for $510.50 on August 4th, and one for $440.50 on the National Shoe and Leather Bank, to bearer, on August 8th. This last, in some inexplicable way, had been cashed at the very bank itself. Believing that the forger had at last been caught, the precinct detectives later on, during the evening of Parker's arrest, visited No West 38th Street, and on inquiring for Mrs. Parker, were introduced to a young girl of attractive appearance to whom they delivered their unwelcome message. Mrs. Parker seemed overwhelmed at the news and strongly asserted her confidence in her husband's innocence of any wrongdoing. Having performed their errand, the officers departed. A certain ineradicable jealousy has always existed between the plainclothes men of the various precincts and the sleuths attached to the central office, and in this instance the precinct men, having gained the credit for the arrest, it did not occur to them as necessary to communicate the knowledge of their acquaintance with Mrs. Parker to Detective Sergeants Peabody and Clark, originally assigned at headquarters to investigate the case. It seemed, however, to Peabody very unlikely that Parker had conducted his operations alone, and he therefore at once inquired at the Tombs what character of visitors came to see the prisoner. The gateman replied that as yet none had arrived. At that very instant a young girl stepped to the wicket and asked if she could be allowed to see Mr. James Parker. It took the detective but a moment to run across to the criminal courts building and to telephone the warden to detain her temporarily and then to refuse her request. 5 minutes later the girl emerged disconsolately from the Tombs and boarded a car going uptown. Peabody followed her to 110 West 38th Street, not for an instant supposing that the girl herself could be the forger, but believing that possibly through her he might learn of other members of the gang and secure additional evidence against Parker himself. Of course, no intelligent person today supposes that, outside of Sir Conan Doyle's interesting novels, detectives seek the baffling criminal by means of analyzing cigar butts, magnifying thumb marks, or specializing in the various perfumes in favor among the fair sex, or by any of those complicated, brain fatiguing processes of ratiocination indulged in by our old friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. There are still, however, genuine detectives, and some of them are to be found upon the New York police force. The magnifying glass is not one of the ordinary tools of the professional sleuth, and if he carries a pistol at all it is because the police rules require it, while those cases may be numbered upon the fingers of two hands where his own hair and whiskers are not entirely sufficient for his purposes in the course of his professional career. The next morning Peabody donned the most disreputable suit in his wardrobe, neglected his ordinary visit to the barber, and called at 110 West 38th Street, being, of course, at this time entirely unaware of the fact that the girl was Parker's wife. He found her sitting in a rocking chair in a comfortable, well-furnished room, and reading a magazine. Assuming an expression of sheepish inanity, he informed her that he was an old pal of Jim's who had been so unfortunate as to be locked up in the same cell with him at headquarters, and that the latter was in desperate need of morphine. That Parker was an habitual user of the drug could be easily seen from the most casual inspection, but that it would prove an open sesame to the girl's confidence was, as the detective afterward testified, 100 to 1 shot. "Poor Jim!" exclaimed the girl. "Couldn't you smuggle some into the Tombs for him?" Peabody took the hint. "Of course he could. It would be a hard job, those turnkeys were so suspicious. But he could do it for her if anybody could." He rambled on, telling his experiences with Parker in the past, how he had been in Elmira Reformatory and elsewhere with him, and gaining each moment valuable information from the girl's exclamations, questions, and expression. He soon learned that she was Parker's wife, that they were living in comparative comfort, and that she was an exceedingly clever and well-educated woman, but she said nothing during the conversation which would indicate that she knew anything of her husband's offenses or of any persons connected with them. After a few moments the girl slipped on her coat and hat and the two started down to the Tombs, where, by pre-arrangement with the officials, the detective succeeded in convincing her that he had been able to send in to her husband a small hypodermic syringe, commonly called the needles, which she had purchased at a neighboring drug store. The apparent success of this undertaking put Mrs. Parker in excellent humor, and she invited the supposed crook to breakfast with her at the Broadway Central Hotel. So far, it will be observed, Peabody had accomplished practically nothing. At breakfast the girl inquired of her companion what his particular graft was, to which he replied that he was an expert second-story man, and then proceeded to indulge his imagination in accounts of bold robberies in the brown stone districts and clever tricks in other cities, which left Mrs. Parker in no doubt but that her companion was an expert gun of long experience. Then he took, as he expressed it, another chance. "Jim wanted me to tell you to put the gang wise," said he. The girl looked at him sharply and contracted her brows. "Gang?" she exclaimed. "What gang?" "Oh, perhaps he meant Dutch and Sweeney." Peabody bit his lip. He had had a close call. "Don't know," he replied, "he didn't say who they were just to put them wise." A second time the detective had made a lucky hit, for Mrs. Parker suddenly laid aside all pretense and asked, "Do you want to make a lot of money?" Peabody allowed that he did. "Do you know what they have got Jim for?" asked the girl. "Phony paper, wasn't it?" "Yes," said Mrs. Parker, "but Jim didn't write those checks. I wrote them myself. If you want to go in with me, we can earn enough money to get Jim out, and you can do a good turn for yourself besides." The detective's blood leaped in his veins, but he held himself under control as well as he could and answered indifferently, "I guess not. I never met a woman that was very good at that sort of game." "Oh, you don't know me," she persisted. "Why, I can copy anything in a few moments, really I can." "Too dangerous," remarked Peabody. "I might get settled for 10 years. "No, you wouldn't," she continued. "It's the easiest thing in the world. All you have to do is to pick the mail out of some box on a corner. I can show you how. With a copper wire and a little piece of wax, and you are sure to find among the letters somebody's check in payment of a bill. There at once you have the bank and the signature. Then all you have to do is to write a letter to the bank asking for a new checkbook, saying yours is used up, and sign the name that appears on The check. If you can fool the cashier into giving your messenger a checkbook, you can gamble pretty safely on his paying a check signed with the same name. In that way, you see, you can get all the blank checks you need and test the cashier's watchfulness at the same time. It's too easy. The only thing you have to look out for is not to overdraw the account. Still, you find so many checks in the mail that you can usually choose somebody's account that will stand the strain. Do you know, I have made hundreds of checks and the banks have certified every single one. Peabody laughed good-naturedly. Things were looking up a bit. What do you think I am, anyhow? He asked. I must look like a come-on. I'm giving it to you straight, she said simply. After you have made out a good fat check, then you go to a store, buy something, tell them to forward the check to the bank for certification, and that you'll send for the goods and the change the next day. The bank always certifies the check, and you get the money. Not always, said Peabody with a grin. No, not always, acquiesced Mrs. Parker. But Jim and I have been averaging over $100 a day for months. Good graft, all right, assented the detective. But how does the one who lays down the check identify himself? For instance, suppose I go into Tiffany's and pick out a diamond, and say I'm Mr. John Smith, of 100 West 100th Street, and the floor walker says, sorry, Mr. Smith, but we don't know you, what? Then. Just flash a few letters on him, said the girl. Letters and envelopes. Where do you get 'em? Asked Peabody. Just write them, silly, and send them to yourself through the mail. That's all right, retorted the second-story man. But how can I mail myself a letter to 100 West 100th Street when I don't live there? Mrs. Parker smiled in a superior manner. I'm glad I can put you wise to a new game, I invented it myself. You want letters of identification? In different names and addresses on different days? Very good. Buy a bundle of stamped envelopes and write your own name and address on them in pencil. When they arrive, rub off the pencil address. Then if you want to be John Smith of 100 West 100th Street or anybody else, just address the cancelled envelope in ink. Mabel, said Peabody with admiration, you've got the gray matter all right. You can have me, if you can deliver the rest of the goods. Fig.3 A letterhead frill of Mabel Parker's. Fig.3 A letterhead frill of Mabel Parker's. There's still another little frill, she continued, pleased at his compliment, if you want to do the thing in style. Maybe you will find a letter or bill head in the mail at the same time that you get your sample check. If you do, you can have it copied and write your request for the checkbook and your order for the goods on paper printed exactly like it. That gives a sort of final touch, you know. I remember we did that with a dentist named Bud, at 137 West 22nd Street. Fig 3. You've got all the rest whipped to a standstill, cried Peabody. Well, just come over to the room and I'll show you something worthwhile, exclaimed the girl, getting up and paying their bill. Now, said she, when they were safely at No West 38th Street, and she had closed the door of the room and drawn Peabody to a desk in the bay window. Here's my regular handwriting. She pulled towards her a pad which lay open upon the desk and wrote in a fair, round hand, Mrs. James D. Singley. Fig 4. This, she continued, changing her slant and dashing off a queer feminine scrawl, is the signature we fooled the Lincoln National Bank with, Miss Causers, you know. And this, she added a moment later, adopting a stiff, shaky, humpbacked orthography, is the signature that got poor Jim into all this trouble, and she inscribed twice upon the paper the name A. Bierstadt. Poor Jim. She added to herself. By George, Mabel, remarked the detective, you're a wonder. See if you can copy my name. And Peabody wrote the assumed name of William Hickey, first with a stub and then with a fine point, both of which signatures she copied like a flash, in each case, however, being guilty of the lapse of spelling the word William. The pad now contained more than enough evidence to convict 20 women. And Peabody, with the remark, you don't want to leave this kind of thing lying around, Mabel, pretended to tear the page up, but substituted a blank sheet in its place and smuggled the precious bit of paper into his pocket. Yes, I'll go into business with you, sure I will, said Peabody. And we'll get enough money to set Jim free, exclaimed the girl. They were now fast friends, and it was agreed that Hickey should go and make himself presentable, after which they would dine at some restaurant and then sample a convenient mailbox. Meantime Peabody telephoned to headquarters. And when the two set out for dinner at 6 o'clock, the supposed Hickey was stopped on Broadway by Detective Sergeant Clark. What are you doing here in New York? Demanded Clark. Didn't I give you 6 hours to fly the coop? And who's this woman? Fig 4. The upper signature is an example of Mabel Parker's regular penmanship, the next 2 are forgeries from memory, and the last is a dashing imitation of her companion's handwriting. Fig 4. The upper signature is an example of Mabel Parker's regular penmanship, the next 2 are forgeries from memory, and the last is a dashing imitation of her companion's handwriting. I was going, Clark, honest I was, whined Hickey, and this lady's all right. She hasn't done a thing. Well, I guess I'll have to lock you up at headquarters for the night, said Clark roughly. The girl can go. Oh, Mr. Clark, do come and have dinner with us first, exclaimed Mrs. Parker. Mr. Hickey has been very good to me, and he hasn't had anything to eat forever. So long. Don't care if I do, said Clark. I guess I can put up with the company if the board is good. The three entered the Raleigh Hotel and ordered a substantial meal. With the arrival of dessert, however, the girl became uneasy, and apparently fearing arrest herself, slipped a roll of bills under the table to Hickey and whispered to him to keep it for her. The detective, thinking that the farce had gone far enough, threw the money on the table and asked Clark to count it, at the same tune telling Mrs. Parker that she was in custody. The girl turned white, uttered a little scream, and then, regaining her self-possession, remarked as nonchalantly as you please. Well, clever as you think you are, you have destroyed the only evidence against me, my handwriting. Not much, remarked Peabody, producing the sheet of paper. The girl saw that the game was up and made a mock bow to the two detectives. I take off my hat to the New York police, said she. At this time, apparently, no thought of denying her guilt had entered her mind. And at the station house she talked freely to the sergeant, the matron and the various newspaper men who were present, even drawing pictures of herself upon loose sheets of paper and signing her name, apparently rather enjoying the notoriety which her arrest had occasioned. A thorough search of her apartment was now made, with the result that several sheets of paper were found there, bearing what were evidently practice signatures of the name of Alice Causer. Fig. 5. Evidence was also obtained showing that, on the day following her husband's arrest, she had destroyed large quantities of blank checkbooks and blank checks. Upon the trial of Mrs. Parker, the handwriting experts testified that the Bierstadt and Causer signatures were so perfect that it would be difficult to state that they were not originals. The Parker woman was what is sometimes known as a free hand forger. She never traced anything, and as her forgeries were written by a muscular imitation of the pen movement of the writer of the genuine signature, they were almost impossible of detection. When Albert T. Patrick forged the signature of old Mr. Rice to the spurious will of 1900 and to the checks for $25,000, $65,000, and $135,000 upon Swenson's Bank and the Fifth Avenue Trust Co., the forgeries were easily detected from the fact that as Patrick had traced them, they were all almost exactly alike and practically could be superimposed one upon another, line for line, dot for dot. 1. 1C Infra, p. 304. Fig. 5 Practice signatures of the name of Alice Causer. Fig. 5 Practice signatures of the name of Alice Causer. Mabel Parker's early history is shrouded in a certain amount of obscurity, but there is reason to believe that she was the offspring of respectable laboring people who turned her over, while she was still an infant, to a Mr. and Mrs. Prentice, instructors in physical culture in the public schools, first of St. Louis, and later of St. Paul, Minnesota. As a child, and afterwards as a young girl, she exhibited great precocity and a considerable amount of real ability in drawing and in English composition, but her very cleverness and versatility were the means of her becoming much more sophisticated than most young women of her age, with the result that while still in her teens she gave her adopted parents ground for considerable uneasiness. Accordingly they decided to place her for the next few years in a convent near New York. By this time she had attained a high degree of proficiency in writing short stories and miscellaneous articles, which she illustrated herself, for the papers and inferior magazines. Convent life proved very dull for this young lady, and accordingly one dark evening, she made her exit from the cloister by means of a conveniently located window. Waiting for her in the grounds below was James Parker, 27 years old. Already of a large criminal experience, although never yet convicted of crime. The two made their way to New York, were married, and the girl entered upon her career. Her husband, whose real name was James D. Singley, was a professional tenderloin crook, ready to turn his hand to any sort of cheap crime. To satisfy his appetites and support life, the money easily secured was easily spent, and Singley, at the time of his marriage, was addicted to most of the vices common to the habitués of the underworld. His worst enemy was the morphine habit, and from her husband Mrs. Singley speedily learned the use of the drug. At this time Mabel Prentice Parker Singley was about 5 feet 2 inches in height, weighing not more than 105 or 110 pounds, slender to girlishness and showing no maturity save in her face, which, with its high color, brilliant blue eyes, and her yellow hair, often led those who glanced at her casually to think her good-looking. Further inspection, however, revealed a fox-like expression, an irregularity in the position of the eyes, a hardness in the lines of the mouth, and a flatness of the nose which belied the first impression. This was particularly true when, after being deprived of morphine in the Tombs, her ordinary high color gave way at her second trial to a waxy paleness of complexion. But the story of her career in the Tenderloin would prove neither profitable nor attractive. Fig. 6 The check on which the indictment for forgery was brought. Fig. 6 The check on which the indictment for forgery was brought. The subsequent history of the Parker case is a startling example of the credulity of the ordinary jury. The evidence secured was absolutely conclusive, but unfortunately juries are generally unwilling to take the uncorroborated word of a policeman against that of a defendant, particularly if the defendant be a young and pretty woman. Here at the very outset was a complete confession on the part of Mrs. Parker, supplemented by illustrations from her own pen of what she could do. Comparison showed that the signatures she had written without a model upon the Peabody sheet were identical with those upon the forged checks. Fig. 6, and with Mr. Bierstadt's and Miss Causer's handwriting. When Mrs. Parker's case, therefore, came on for pleading, her counsel, probably because they could think of nothing else to do, entered a plea of insanity. It was also intimated that the young woman would probably plead guilty, and the case was therefore placed upon the calendar and moved for trial without much preparation on the part of the prosecution, instead of this young person confessing her guilt. However, she amused herself by ogling the jury and drawing pictures of the court, the district attorney and the various witnesses. Probably no more extraordinary scene was ever beheld in a court of law than that exhibited by Part 2 of the General Sessions upon Mabel Parker's first trial for forgery. Attired in a sky blue dress and picture hat, with new white gloves, she sat jauntily by the side of her counsel throughout the proceedings, toying with her pen and pencil, and in the very presence of the jury copying handwriting which was given her for that purpose by various members of the yellow press who crowded close behind the rail. From time to time she would dash off an aphorism or a paragraph in regard to the trial which she handed to a reporter. If satisfactory, this was elaborated and sometimes even illustrated by her for the evening edition of his paper. The assistant district attorney complained that this was clearly a contempt of court, particularly as the defendant had drawn a picture not only of himself, but of the presiding justice and a witness, which had appeared in one of the evening papers. The court, however, did not see that anything could be done about it, and the girl openly continued her literary and artistic recreation. The court itself was not a little amused at the actions of the defendant, and when Detective Peabody was called to the stand, the general hilarity had reached such a pitch that he was unable to give his testimony without smiling. The natural result, therefore, at the first trial, was that the detective succeeded in giving the unqualified impression that he was drawing the long bow in a most preposterous fashion. At the conclusion of the people's case, the evidence that Mrs. Parker had forged the checks amounted simply to this, that an officer who was greatly interested in her conviction had sworn to a most astonishing series of facts from which the jury must infer that this exceedingly astute young person had not only been entirely and completely deceived by a detective, but also that at almost their first meeting she had confessed to him in detail the history of her crimes. Practically, the only other evidence tending to corroborate his story were a few admissions of a similar character made by her to newspaper men, matrons, and officers at the police station. Unless the jury were to believe that Mrs. Parker had actually written the signatures on the Peabody sheet, there was no evidence that she was the actual forger, hence upon Peabody's word alone depended the verdict of the jury. The trouble with the case was that it was too strong, too good, to be entirely credible, and had there been no defense it is exceedingly probable that the trial would have resulted in an acquittal, since the prosecution had elected to go to the jury upon the question of whether or not the defendant had actually signed the checks herself. Mrs. Parker, however, had withdrawn her plea of insanity and determined to put in a defense, which proved in its turn to be even more extraordinary than the case against her. This, in brief, was to the effect that she had known Peabody to be a police officer all along, but that it had occurred to her that if she could deceive him into believing that it was she herself who had committed the forgeries, her husband might get off, and that later she might in turn establish her own innocence. She had therefore hastily scratched her name on the top of a sheet already containing her husband's handwriting and had told Peabody that the signatures had been written by herself. That the sheet had been written in the officer's presence she declared to be a pure invention on his part to secure her conviction. She told her extremely illogical story with a certain winsome naivete, which carried an air of semi-probability with it. From her deportment on the stand one would have taken her for a boarding school miss who in some inconsequent fashion had got mixed up in a frolic for which no really logical explanation could be given. Then the door in the back of the courtroom opened and James Parker was led to the bar, where in the presence of the jury he pleaded guilty to the forgery of the very signature for which his wife was standing trial. Causer check, Fig. 6. He was then sworn as a witness, took the stand and testified that he had written all the forged signatures to the checks, including the signatures upon the Peabody sheet. The district attorney found himself in an embarrassing position. If Parker was the forger, why not challenge him to write the forged signatures upon the witness stand and thus to prove his alleged capacity for so doing? The obvious objection to this was that Parker, in anticipation of this test, had probably been practicing the signature in the tombs for months. On the other hand, if the district attorney did not challenge him to write the signatures, the defense would argue that he was afraid to do so, and that as Parker had sworn himself to be the forger, it was not incumbent upon the defense to prove it further, that was a matter for cross-examination. With considerable hesitation, the prosecuting attorney asked Parker to write the causer signature, which was the one set forth in the indictment charging the forgery, and after much backing and filling on the part of the witness, who ingeniously complained that he was in a bad nervous condition owing to lack of morphine, in consequence of which his hand trembled and he was in no condition to write forgeries, the latter took his pen and managed to make a very fair copy of the causer signature from memory, good enough in fact to warrant a jury in forming the conclusion that he was in fact the forger. Fig. 7. This closed the case. The defense claimed that it was clear that James Parker was the forger, since he had admitted it in open court, pleaded guilty to the indictment and proved that he had the capacity. The prosecution, upon the other hand, argued that the evidence was conclusive that the defendant herself was the writer of the check. The whole thing boiled down to whether or not the jury was going to believe that Mrs. Parker had written the Peabody sheet in the presence of the detective, when her husband claimed that, with the exception of Mabel's signature, he had done it himself and carelessly left the paper in his desk in the room. Fig. 7. Parker's copy of the signature of Alice Causer, made in court in an attempt to shield his wife. Fig. 7. Parker's copy of the signature of Alice Causer, made in court in an attempt to shield his wife. The prosecuting attorney was at his wit's end for an argument to meet the fact that Parker had written a sample forgery of the Causer signature before the very eyes of the jury. He found it at last in an offer on his own part in open court, during his summing up, to write for the jury from memory a better forgery of the Causer signature than that written by Parker himself, and thus to show how simple a matter it was to learn to do so. He had taken up his pen and was about to give a sample of his handiwork in this respect when the defendant grasped her counsel's arm and whispered, "For God's sake, don't let him do it." Whereupon the lawyer arose and objected, saying that such evidence was improper, as the case was closed, as might have been expected under the circumstances. Considering the blunders of the prosecution and the ingenuous appearance of the defendant, the trial ended in a disagreement, the jury standing 8-4 for acquittal. The district attorney's office now took up a thorough investigation of the case, with the result that on a second prosecution Mrs. Parker was confronted with a mass of evidence which it was impossible for her to refute. A boy named Wallace Sweeney, sentenced to the Elmira Reformatory, was found to have been an active accomplice of the Parkers for several years, and he was accordingly brought down to New York, where he gave a complete history of his relations with them. His story proved beyond any doubt that Mrs. Parker was the forger of the checks in the possession of the district attorney, and of many others beside, some of them for very large amounts. The evidence of Sweeney was of itself quite sufficient to warrant a conviction. To make assurance doubly sure, however, the district attorney upon the second trial moved a new indictment, setting forth as the forgery a check signed E. Bierstadt, so that when Parker took the stand, as he had done in the former trial, and testified that he was the forger, he found himself unable to write this new signature, and hence his testimony went for nothing. But even the testimony of Sweeney was that of an accomplice, requiring corroboration, while that of Peabody remained the evidence of a mere policeman, eager to convict the defendant and add another scalp to his official belt. With an extraordinary accumulation of evidence, the case hinged on the veracity of these two men, to which was opposed the denial of the defendant and her husband. It is an interesting fact that in the final analysis of the case the jury were compelled to determine the issue by evidence entirely documentary in character. It is also an illustration of what tiny facts stamp whole masses of testimony as true or false. On her examination, Mrs. Parker had sworn, among other things, 1. That she had no knowledge of the envelope, the back of which had been used by Parker for the purpose of directing Rogers, Pete & Co. to deliver the clothes and money to his messenger, and, of course, that the words Mr. G.O.B. Lang were not in her handwriting. This was one of the envelopes claimed by the prosecution to have been originally addressed in pencil and sent to themselves by the Parkers through the mail for this precise purpose. 2. That she had never seen the Causer practice sheets, and that the words Alice Causer, repeated hundreds of times thereon, were not in her handwriting. For some reason unknown to the district attorney, however, she admitted having written the words "I am upstairs" in the bathroom upon a similar sheet, but claimed that at the time this was done, the reverse of the paper was entirely blank. Microscopic examination showed that among the words Alice and Causer on the practice sheet someone had written a capital M. One of the legs of the M crossed and was superimposed upon a letter in the word Alice. Hence, whoever wrote the M knew what was on the practice sheet. An enlargement of this M and a comparison of it with the M in the defendant's signature to her formal examination in the police court, with the M in Mr. in the address on the envelope and with that in the Mrs. on the Peabody sheet, rendered it obvious that they were all written by one and the same hand. Therefore it was clear that the defendant was familiar with the contents of the practice sheets, Fig. 8, even if she had not written them herself and had not told the truth in this regard. Moreover, it was fairly easy to see that the same hand that had written the words "I am upstairs" in the bathroom upon the second practice sheet had at the same time and with the same pen written the rest of the sheet. This was clearly perceptible on examining the E's and A's. A comparison of the address Mr. G.O.B. Lang, on Fig. 1, with the name Mrs. James D. Singley, on Fig. 4, also shows clearly that one and the same person wrote them both. And to the accuracy of all these self-evident propositions a leading handwriting expert in New York added his unqualified opinion. Thus, but for a little carelessness in failing to destroy odd scraps of paper and to disguise her penmanship, which it seemed to her quite unnecessary to do, as in the address of the Lang envelope, Mrs. Parker might well have gone free after all. It is impossible to describe all the varied dramatic features of this interesting case. No one who was present is likely to forget the impression made by the Defendant at her second trial, when in defiance of overwhelming proof she still struggled to vindicate herself. Her counsel contended throughout the trial that she was a hitherto innocent young woman led astray and started upon a criminal career by a rascally husband, whom she still loved devotedly and for whose sake she had prepared to confess herself a criminal. That James Parker introduced his wife to a life of crime there can be no doubt, but that she had a natural predilection for it must be equally obvious. It is probably true that Mabel Parker's affection for her convict husband was unfeigned and deep. The natural repugnance of the American jury for convicting a woman was shown when, in spite of the overwhelming proof upon the Parker woman's second trial, the jury remained out 8 hours and then found her guilty of uttering only, with a strong recommendation for mercy. She was sentenced to the Bedford Reformatory. Fig 8, one of the loose sheets upon which Mabel Parker illustrated her methods and her skill as a penman to the supposed ex-convict Hickey. Story 15. $500 million. This story, which ends in New York, begins in the department of the Gironde at the town of Montsayre, 75 kilometers from Bordeaux, in the little vineyard of Monsieur Émile Lapierre, landowner. In 1901 Lapierre was a happy and contented man, making a good living out of his modest farm. Today, he is well, if you understand the language of the Gironde, he will tell you with a shrug of his broad shoulders that he might have been a Monte Cristo had not Le Bon Dieu willed it otherwise. For did he not almost have $500 million, 2.5 milliards of francs in his very hands? Hein. But he did. Does Monsieur have doubts? Nevertheless it is all true. C'est trop vrai. Is Monsieur tired? And would he care to hear the story? There is a comfortable chair sous le grand arbre in front of the veranda, and Madame will give Monsieur a glass of wine from the presses, across the road. Yes, it is good wine, but there is little profit in it, when one thinks in milliards. The landowner lights his pipe and seats himself cross-legged against the trunk of the big chestnut. Back of the house the vineyard slopes away toward the distant woods in straight, green, trellised alleys. A dim haze hangs over the landscape. Sleeping so quietly in the midsummer afternoon. Down the road comes heavily, creaking and swaying, a wain loaded with a huge tower of empty casks and drawn by 2 oxen, their heads swinging to the dust. Yes, it is hard to comprendre 2,500 million francs. It was this way. Madame Lapierre was a Tessie of Bordeaux, an ancient bourgeois family, and very proud indeed of being bourgeois. You can see her passing and repassing the window if you watch carefully the kitchen, where she is superintending dinner. The Tessies have always lived in Bordeaux, and they are connected by marriage with everybody from the blacksmith up to the mayor's notary. Once a Tessie was mayor himself. Years and years ago. Madame's great-uncle Jean had emigrated to America, and from time to time, vague rumors of the wealth he had achieved in the new country reached the ears of his relatives, but no direct word ever came. Then one hot day like this appeared MLE General. He came walking down the road in the dust from the Gare, in his tall silk hat and frock coat and gold-headed cane, and stopped before the house to ask if one of the descendants of a certain Jean Tessie did not live hereabouts. He was fat and red-faced, and he perspired, but Dieu, he was distingué, and he had an order in his buttonhole. Madame Lapierre, who came out to answer his question, knew at once that he was an aristocrat. Ah! Was she herself the grandniece of Jean Tessie? Then, heaven be thanked, the general's toilsome journey was ended. He had much to tell them when he should be rested. He removed the silk hat and mopped his shining forehead. He must introduce himself that he might have credit with Madame, else she might hardly listen to his story, for there had never been a tale like it before since the world was. Let him present himself. MLE General Pedro Suarez de Moreno, Count de Tinoco and Marquis de la Dehesa. Although one was fatigued, it refreshed one to be the bearer of good news, and such was his mission. Let Madame prepare herself to hear. Yes, it would be proper for her to call MCO, her husband, that he might participate. Over a draught of this same vintage, MLE General imparted to them the secret. Lapierre laughs and shrugs his shoulders as he recalls the scene. The apoplectic General, with the glass of wine in one hand, waving the other grandiloquently as he described the wealth about to descend upon them. Yes, the General must begin at the beginning, for it was a long story. First, as to himself and how he came to know of the affair. It had been on his return from the Philippines after the surrender of Manila, where he had been in command of the armies of Spain, that he had paused for repose in New York and had first learned of the Tessie inheritance. The precise manner of his discovery was left somewhat indefinite, but the Lapierres were not particular. So many distinguished persons had played a part in the drama that the recital left but a vague impression as to individuals. A certain Madame Lucia, widow of one Roquefailer, whom he had accidentally met, had apparently been the instrument of Providence in disclosing the history of Jean Tessie to the General. She herself had been wronged by the villains and knew all the secrets of the conspirators. But she had waited for a suitable opportunity to speak. Jean Tessie had died possessed of properties which today, 70 years after, were worth in the neighborhood of $500 million. The General paused for the effect, solemnly nodding his head at his astounded auditors in a firm answer. Yes, it was even so. $500 million. No more and no less. Then he once more took up the thread of his narrative. Tessie's lands, originally farms, were today occupied by huge magazines, government buildings, palaces, and hotels. He had been a frugal, hard-working, far-seeing man of affairs whose money had doubled itself year by year. Then had appeared one Émeric Lespinasse, a Frenchman, also from Bordeaux, who had plotted to rob him of his estate, and the better to accomplish his purpose had entered the millionaire's employ. When Tessie died, in 1884, Lespinasse had seized his papers and the property, destroyed his will, dispersed the clerks, secretaries, notaries, and accountants of the deceased, and quietly got rid of such persons as stood actively in his way. The great wealth thus acquired had enabled him to defy those who knew that he was not entitled to the fortune, and that the real heirs were in far-away France. He had prospered like the bay tree. His daughter, Marie-Louise, had married a distinguished English nobleman, and his sons were now the richest men in America. Yet they lived with the sword of Damocles over their heads, suspended by a single thread, and the General had the knife wherewith to cut it. Lespinasse, among other things, had caused the murder of the husband of Madame Lucia. And she was in possession of conclusive proofs which, at the proper moment, could be produced to convict him of his many crimes, or at least to oust his sons and daughter from the stolen inheritance. It was a weird, bizarre nightmare, no more astonishing than the novels the Lapierres had read. America, they understood, was a land where the rivers were full of gold, a country of bronzed and handsome savages, of birds of paradise, and ruined Aztec temples, of vast tobacco fields and plantations of thousands of acres of cotton cultivated by naked slaves, while one lay in a hammock fanned by a petite negra and languidly sipped eau sucrée. The General had made it all seem very, very real. At the weak spots he had gesticulated convincingly and digressed upon his health. Then, while the narrative was fresh and he might have had to answer questions about it had he given his listeners opportunity to ask them, he had hastily told of a visit to Tunis. There he had by chance encountered Marie-Louise, the daughter of Lespinasse, living with her noble husband in a handsome oriental palace, had been invited to dine with them and had afterward seized the occasion while walking in the garden with the lady to disclose the fact that he knew all, and had it in his power to ruin them as impostors. Marie-Louise had been frightfully angry, but afterward her better nature had suggested the return of the inheritance, or at least 100 millions or so, to the rightful heirs. The general had left the palace believing all would be well, and had retired to Paris to await letters and further developments, but these had never come, and he had discovered that he had been deceived. It had been merely a ruse on the part of the woman and her husband to gain time, and now every step that he took was dogged by spies in the pay of the Lespinasses, who followed him everywhere. But the right would triumph. He had sworn to run the conspiracy to earth. Many hours were consumed in the telling of the story. The Lapierres were enchanted. More than that, they were convinced, persuaded that they were heirs to the richest inheritance in the world, which comprised most of the great American city of New York. Persons who were going to participate in 2,500 millions of francs could afford to be hospitable. MLE General stayed to dinner. A list of the heirs living in or near Bordeaux was made out with the share of each in the inheritance carefully computed. Madame Lapierre's was only $50 million, but still that was almost enough to buy up Bordeaux. And they could purchase Montsère as a country place. The general spoke of a stable of automobiles by means of which the journey from Bordeaux to the farm could be accomplished in the space of an hour. That night the good man and his wife scarcely closed their eyes, and the next day, accompanied by the general, they visited Bordeaux and the neighboring towns and broke the news gently to the other heirs. There was M. Petit, the veterinary at Mormont, Tessy, the blacksmith in Bordeaux, M. Paligue and his wife, M. Roger, M. Cazenave and his son, and others. One branch of the family lived in Brazil, the Jubinfrères, and one Tessy of Saint Bézaille. These last had to be reached by post, a most annoyingly slow means of communication. Mais que voulez-vous? Those were busy days in and around Bordeaux, and the general was the center of attraction. What a splendid figure he cut in his tall silk hat and gold-headed cane. But they were all very careful to let no inkling of their good fortune leak out, for it might spoil everything, give some opportunity to the spies of the impostor Lespinasse to fabricate new chains of title or to prepare for a defense of the fortune. The little blacksmith, being addicted to white wine, was the only one who did not keep his head. But even he managed to hold his mouth sufficiently shut. A family council was held. MLE General was given full power of attorney to act for all the heirs, and each having contributed an insignificant sum toward his necessary expenses, they waved him a tremulous goodbye as he stood on the upper deck of the steamer, his silk hat in one hand and his gold-headed cane in the other. "He will get it, if anyone can," cried the blacksmith enthusiastically. "It is as good as ours already," echoed Roger. "My friends," Madame Lapierre assured them, "a general of the armies of Spain and a chevalier of the Order of Jimenez would die rather than fail in his mission. Besides," she added, her French blood asserting itself, "he is to get 19% of the inheritance." As long as the steamer remained in sight, the general waved encouragingly, his hat raised toward heaven. "Mais," says Lapierre, with another shrug as he lights his pipe, even you would have believed him. Vraiment. He would have deceived the devil himself. Up the road the wain comes creaking back again. A crow flaps across the vineyard, laughing scornfully at good Lapierre, and you yourself wonder if such a thing could have been possible. On a rainy afternoon in March, 1905, there entered the writer's office in the Criminal Courts Building, New York City, a ruddy, stoutly built man, dressed in homespun garments, accompanied by an attractive and vivacious little woman, who, while unable to speak a single word of English, had no difficulty in making it obvious that she had a story to tell of the most vital importance. An interpreter was soon found and the names of the visitors disclosed. The lady, who did the talking for both of them, introduced herself as Madame Valois Redon, of Bordeaux, and her companion as M. Émile Lapierre, landowner, of Montsayre. They had come, she explained, from France to take possession of the inheritance. Tessie. She was a personal friend of Madame Lapierre, and as the Tessies had exhausted all their money in paying the expenses connected with securing the fortune, she, being a well-to-do gentlewoman, had come to their assistance, and for the last few months had been financing the enterprise on a 15% basis. If Madame Lapierre was to receive $10 million, then, to be sure, Madame Redon would have $1,500,000, but, of course, it was not for the money, but on account of friendship, that she was aiding them. I would understand that 3 years had elapsed since a certain distinguished General Pedro Suarez de Moreno had disclosed to the Lapierres the fact that Madame was the heiress to the greatest estate in America. M. Lapierre solemnly nodded confirmation as the lady proceeded. It was the one subject talked about in the Gironde and Bordeaux, that is, among those who had been fortunate enough to learn anything about it. And for 3 years the Tessies, their wives, their sons' wives, and their connections, had been waiting to receive the glad tidings that the conspirators had been put to rout and the rightful heirs reinstated. It was some time before the good lady succeeded in convincing her auditor that such a ridiculous fraud as she described had actually been perpetrated. But there was M. Lapierre and there was Madame Valerie Redon sitting in the office as living witnesses to the fact. What wonderful person could this General Moreno be, who could hypnotize a hard-headed, thrifty farmer from the Gironde and a clever little French woman from Bordeaux into believing that $500 million was waiting for them on the other side of the Atlantic? I expressed my surprise. Madame Redon shrugged her sloping shoulders. Well, perhaps it was hard for MCO to believe, but then there were the proofs, the documents, the dossier, and, most of all, there was the general himself. Oh, if MCO could see the general in his tall silk hat and gold-headed cane. I asked for the documents. Madame Redon opened her bag and produced a package of nearly 100 letters, written in a fine Spanish hand. Oh! He had been a wonderful writer, this gorgeous Count de Tinoco and Marquis de la Dehesa. She had met him herself when he had been in Bordeaux. Madame Lapierre had introduced him to her, and she had heard him talk. How beautifully he talked! The stories of his experiences as general of the armies of Spain under Don Carlos and as brigadier general in the Philippines were as fascinating as a romance. But it was his letters which had really led her to take a personal interest in the undertaking. With a sigh Madame Valois untied the little blue ribbon which bound up the pitiful little history. If MCO would be good enough to grant the time, she would begin at the beginning. Here was his first letter written after the general's return to America. June 25, '02. My dear M. Lapierre, We have had a terrible voyage. A horrible storm broke loose in mid-ocean, endangering all our lives. The waves, like mountains, threatened every instant to swallow us all. The spectacle was terrifying. I fell from the top of the stairs, way down into the hole, sick, hurting my right leg in the center of the tibia bone. The ship's doctor, who is nothing but a stupid fool, left me helpless almost the entire day. If ever I should have dreamt what would occur to me in this trip, not for all the gold in the world would I have embarked. But, now that I am here, I shall not retreat before any obstacle, in order to arrive at the fulfillment of my enterprise, and no matter at what cost, even at that of my life. It is necessary that I succeed. My pride demands it. Those who are in the right shall triumph, that is sure. In the meantime, will you kindly give my regards to Madam and your son, and all of your relatives, not forgetting your good old servant. Squeezing your hand cordially, I bid you adieu. Your devoted Pedro de Moreno. Can you not see the waves, and observe him falling down the hole? Asks Madame Redon. Mais, voici un autre. July 11, 1902. M. Jean Lapierre. My dear M. Lapierre, as soon as I could walk a little I began my research for the impostors of the inheritance Tessie. Without a doubt some person who is interested in the case has already advised them of my arrival in New York, and to take the necessary precautions to lead me astray in my researches. Already I have discovered almost everything. I know even the house in which resided the deceased before his death. It is a house of 25 stories high, which resembles the Church of Saint Magdalene in Paris. Today it is the biggest bank in New York. I have visited it from top to bottom, ascending and descending in steel elevators. This is a marvelous palace. It is worth more than $5 million. The house itself has the numbers 100, 102, 104, 106, 108, 110, 112, 114, 116 and 118. In other words, it covers the ground of 10 other houses made into one. I have also visited 6 houses belonging to him, which are worth millions and are located around Central Park. As soon as the brothers Lespinasse knew that I had arrived in New York they immediately took their departure, one for Paris to find his father, Émeric Lespinasse, the other to the city of Tuxpan, in Mexico, to visit the properties stolen from the heirs. I have come to an understanding with the Reverend Father Van Rensselaer, Father Superior of the Jesuits, and have offered him $2 million for his poor, in recompense for his aid to recover and to enter into possession of the inheritance. He takes great pains, and is my veritable guide and confidant. I have visited Central Park, also a property of the deceased. This property alone is worth more than $20 million. I have great confidence in my success, and I am almost sure to reach the goal, if you are the heirs, for here there is a mix-up by all the devils. The wound of my leg has much improved, the consequences which I feared have disappeared, and I expect soon my complete convalescence, but the devil has bestowed upon me a toothache, which makes me almost crazy with pain. I shall leave, nevertheless, to begin my campaign. Will you be kind enough to give my regards to your wife and son, and to our old friend, etc., etc. Pedro de Moreno. May the devil bestow upon him 500 million toothaches! Exclaims Lapierre, for the first time showing any sign of animation. The other letters were read in their order, interspersed with Madame Redon's explanations of their effect upon the heirs in France. His description of the elevators of steel and of the house that covered an entire block had caused a veritable sensation. Alas! Those wonders are still wonders to them, and they still, I fancy, more than half believe in them. The letters are lying before me now. Astonishing emanations, totally ridiculous to a prosaic American, but calculated to convince and stimulate the imagination of a petit bourgeois. The general in glowing terms paints his efforts to run down the Lespinasse conspirators. Although suffering horribly from his fractured tibia, when he fell into the hole, and from other dire ills, he has not taken the slightest rest. He has been everywhere: New Orleans, Florida, to the city of Coney Island, to corner the villains, who flee in all directions. The daughter, Marie-Louise, through whom the general expects to secure a compromise, has left for New Orleans. Wonderful coincidence, he writes, they were all living quietly and I believe had no intention whatever to travel, and 2 days after my arrival in New York they all disappeared. The most suspicious of it all is that the banker, his wife and children had left for Coney Island for the summer and to spend their holidays, and certainly they disappeared without saying goodbye to their intimate friends. I have the whole history of Tessie's life and how he made his fortune. There is a family for the use of whom we must give at least $1 million, for the fortune of Tessie was not his alone. He had a companion who shared his troubles and his work. According to the will they were to inherit one from the other. The companion died, and Tessie inherited everything. I do not see the necessity of your trip to New York. That might make noise and perhaps delay my negotiations. Then follows the list of properties embraced in the inheritance. Property and personal estate of the heirs. 1. The land of Central Park ceded to the city of New York, of the value of $5 million. 2. He had at the National Bank United States Bank deposited in gold $20 to $30 million. He never withdrew anything, on the contrary, he always deposited his income. There $25 million. 3. The big house on Broadway, NOS 100 to 118, of 25 stories, today the largest bank in New York, $5 million. 4. The house on Fifth Avenue, number 765. Facing Central Park, today one of the first hotels of New York. Hotel Savoy, $8 million. 5. House on Fifth Avenue, number 767, facing Central Park, today the biggest and most handsomest of American hotels, where the greatest people and millionaires stop. Hotel Netherland, $20 million. 6. 2 coal mines at Focustung in Texas, $9 million. 7. A petroleum mine in Pennsylvania, Mexican frontier, $6 million. 8 shares of silver mine at Tuxpan, Mexico, $10 million. 9. The house at Tuxpan and its grounds, Mexico, $15,000. 10. The pleasure home and grounds in Florida, New Orleans, in the city of Coney Island, $500,000. 11. The house which covers all the Square Plaza, no number because it is all alone. It is an immense palace, with a park and gardens, and waters, forming cascades and labyrinths. Facing Central Park, $12 million. 12. The block of houses on 5th and 6th Avenues, facing on this same Central Park, which, as all these grounds belong to him, he had put up. They are 100 houses, that is called here a block, $30 million. 13. He is the owner of 2 railroads and owns shares of others in Pennsylvania and Canada, $40 million. 14. A line of steam and sailboats Atlantic, the Pennsylvania and the Tessie, and other names 100 million.00. 15. A dock and a quay of 800 meters on the Brooklyn River. 4. His ships 130 million.00. 16. Several values and debts owed him and which at his death had not been collected $40,000. 390,555,000, which is in francs 1,952,775,000, plus 5% or 976,388. Total in francs 1,953,751,388. Do you blame us? Asks Madame Valois, as I listen as politely as possible to this Arabian Nights dream of riches. The letters continue. The general is surrounded by enemies, of which the worst are French, and he is forced continually to change his residence in order to escape their machinations. But all this takes money. How can he go to Tucson or to the city of Coney Island? You cannot know nor imagine the expense which I have had to discover that which I have discovered. I cannot live here like a miser, for the part I represent demands much of me. Every moment I change my residence, and that costs money. He adds a little touch of detail. I must always be dressed properly, and laundry is very dear here. A shirt costs 25 cents to wash, and there are other necessary expenses. You have forgotten to tell me if you have received the album of views of New York in which I have indicated the properties of the deceased. I squeeze your hand. Yes, and our purses too, adds Madame Valois. Would MCO care to see the album of the Tessie properties? Yes. MCO Lapierre, kindly show the gentleman. Lapierre unbuttons his homespun coat and produces a cheap paper-covered blank book in which are pasted small photographs and woodcuts of various well-known New York buildings. It is hard not to smile. MCO will see, continues Madame Valois, that the dream had something substantial about it. When we saw these pictures in Bordeaux we were on the point of giving up in despair, but the pictures convinced us that it was all true. Moreover, just at that time the general intimated that unless he had more money, he might yield to the efforts of the Lespinasse family to buy him off. Madame Valois points vindictively to a certain paragraph in one of the letters. Of course they are convinced that I am not for sale, not for anything. To my regret, my very great regret, I shall be forced to capitulate if you do not come to my aid, and that quickly, for I repeat to you that my funds are all gone. And here is his bill, continues Madame Valois, producing a folded document composed of countless sheets of very thin paper, bound together at the edges by strips of heavier material. This, when unfolded, stretches entirely across the room and is seen to be composed of hundreds of typewritten items, of which the following may serve as illustrations. Expenses in New York. July 12th, train to New Orleans. $25.50. 16, train to Florida. $2.50. Dinner on train. $2. 17, hotel in Florida. $2. 18, trip to Coney Island. $.50. 19, return to Florida. $.50. 21, return from Florida to New Orleans. $2.50. Laundry. $1.15. December 3rd, return to New York. $6.50. 24, train to Veracruz. $57.50. January 4th, trip to Tucson. $2.50. 5, return to Veracruz. $2.50. 6, sudden night trip to Halifax, Nova Scotia, via Buffalo and Niagara Falls. $50.50. 18. Laundry for 3 months. $5. Etc., etc. Extraordinary expenses. To Agent Pushit John, a meerschaum and amber. Cigar holder and pipe. $7. Tobacco jar of shell and silver. $4. To Indian Peter Southgo, a watch, a suit, and a pair of shoes. $16.50. To my general agent of confidential reports. For his daughter, a gold ring and a feather fan. $7. A necktie for himself and scarf pin in gold and with stone for the necktie. $8.60. To the letter carrier to bring me my correspondence and not give it to any one else when I should change address. $4. Invitation to the consul and his 2 agents in Washington hotel. $12. Several invitations to cafes and saloons. To the police agents. $2. Invitations to old employees of Jean Tessie, to tear from them the declarations. $1.50. Barber expenses. $11.50. Tobacco and matches, July to December. 3 packages each week, 10 cents each. $7.80. Changing hotels to lead astray the agents of the impostors. $9.50. Etc., etc. To obtain a colossal fortune as yours will be, it is necessary to spend money unstintingly and to have lots of patience. Court proceedings will be useless, as trickery and lies are necessary to get the best of the scoundrels. It is necessary also to be a scoundrel. That he might well say, interpolates Lapierre. He succeed, say sure. I rapidly glanced over the remaining letters. The general seems always to be upon the verge of compelling a compromise. I have already prepared my net, and the meshes are tightly drawn so that the fish will not be able to escape. 4. An office like this one needs money to go quickly from one place to another, prosecute the usurpers, not allow them an instant's rest. If they go to some city, run after them at once, tire them with my presence and constantly harass them, and by this means compel them to hasten a compromise. The general is meeting with superhuman obstacles. In addition to his enemies, he suffers all sorts of terrible bodily afflictions. Whenever the remittances from the Lapierres do not arrive, the difficulties and diseases increase. At last, however, after an interval of 2 years, things took a turn for the better. A confidential representative of the conspirators, one Mr. Benedict Smith, arrived to make a bona fide offer of $150 million in settlement of the case. The general writes at great length as to exactly in what proportion the money should be divided among the heirs. The thing is so near a culmination that he is greatly exercised over his shabby appearance. I am without a son and too badly dressed to go before the banker in the very likely case of his arrival here. Send me my baggage at once with the first steamer, and mark each piece fragile. This is all. My regards to Madame Lapierre and your son. I am cordially yours, squeezing your hand. Pedro Este Moreno. But the Lapierres and Tessies, while not for an instant distrusting the honesty of the general, had become extremely weary of sending him money. Each heir felt that he had contributed enough toward the general's expenses and invitations. Even the 150 millions within easy reach did not prompt immediate response. About the same time an extraordinary messenger arrived at the Lapierre farm, purporting to come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and instructing Lapierre to repair immediately to Paris. The messenger explained that the presence of Lapierre was desired at the ministry in connection with some investigation then in progress into the affairs of one Jean Tessy. Then the messenger departed as mysteriously as he had arrived. Good M. Lapierre was highly excited. Here was indubitable evidence of the truth of the general's assertions. But, just as the latter had intended, perhaps, the worthy farmer jumped to the conclusion that probably the messenger from Paris had been sent by the conspirators. At the last moment, wrote Lapierre to Moreno, I received from Paris a letter commanding me to go to the ministry, and at the same time a telegram recommending that I leave at once. I shall write you from Paris all that I learn to your interest. If this letter should not reach you sealed in red wax, with small indentations made with a sewing thimble and my initials, which I always sign, it is that our correspondence is seized and read. Events followed in rapid succession. Lapierre, the Tessys, including the little blacksmith, became almost hysterical with excitement. A gentleman, by name Mr. Francis Dellis, called upon Lapierre and offered him $25 million spot cash for his wife's share in the Tessy inheritance. This person also claimed that he had a power of attorney from all the other heirs, with the exception of Petit and Roger, and asserted that he was on the point of embarking for New York in their interest. He urged Lapierre to substitute him for Moreno. But Lapierre, now convinced that everything was as the general had claimed it to be, indignantly rejected any such proposition aimed at his old friend, and sent Mr. Francis Dellis packing about his business. This is what my answer has been to him, sir, we have already an agent with whom we can only have cause to be satisfied, so that your services are not acceptable or needed. He left me most dissatisfied and scolding. The sending of this confederate on the part of the wily general had precisely the effect hoped for. Lapierre and his friends were now convinced that the inheritance Tessy was a reality, and that powerful personages were not only exerting their influence to prevent the rightful heirs from obtaining their property, but had also in some way secured the cooperation of government officials. It was agreed, on all hands, that the worthy landowner, accompanied by Madame Redon, had better proceed at once to the scene of operations and unite with the general in their common purpose. Once on the ground, Lapierre could assume direction of his own campaign. Lapierre and Madame Redon accordingly sailed for America and arrived in New York on the 4th of December, 1904, where they were met on the dock by the general, who, freshly barbered, and with a rose in his buttonhole, invited them, as soon as they had recovered from the fatigue of landing, to make a personal inspection of their properties. These heirs to hundreds of millions of dollars were conducted by the Marquis de la Dehesa and Count de Tinoco to the Battery, where he gallantly seated them in an electric surface car, and proceeded to show them the inheritance. He pointed out successively number 100 Broadway, the Flatiron Building, the Fifth Avenue Hotel and the Holland House, the Waldorf Astoria, the Vanderbilt Mansion at 57th Street and 5th Avenue, the Hotel Savoy and the Hotel Netherland, incidentally taking a cross-town trip to the ferry station at East 23rd Street, and to Bellevue Hospital. A public omnibus conveyed them around Central Park, also their own. And, in spite of the cold weather, the general insisted on showing them the Tessy mansion and estate at Fort George, visible from the Washington Bridge, a beautiful property in the center of a wood. Returning, he took them to the Museum of Natural History and to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which contained Tessy's collections. Having thus given them a bird's-eye view of the promised land, the general escorted them to his apartments and allowed them to see the Ark of the Covenant. in the shape of a somewhat dilapidated leather trunk, which contained a paper alleged to be the will of Jean Tessy, made in Bellevue Hospital, one of his possessions, and unlawfully seized by the Lespinasse family. It was only, Moreno alleged, through the powerful influence of the Jesuits that he had been able to secure and keep a copy of this will. Although the Marquis de la Dehesa must have known that his days were numbered, he was as gay and as entertaining as ever. Then, suddenly, the scales began to fall from Madame Redon's eyes. The promised meeting with Marie Louise Lespinasse and her mysterious representative, Mr. Benedict Smith, was constantly adjourned. The police agents, whom it had been so necessary to entertain and invite to saloons and cafes, were strangely absent, and so were the councillors, Jesuit fathers, bankers, and others who had crowded the general's antechambers. A slatternly Hibernian woman appeared, claiming the hero as her husband. His landlady caused him to be evicted from her premises, and his trunk, containing the famous dossier, was thrown into the street, where it lay until the general himself, placing it upon his princely shoulders, bore it to a 15-cent lodging house. "And now, Monsieur," said little Madame Redon, raising her hands and clasping them entreatingly before her, "we have come to seek vengeance upon this this villain Monsieur. He has taken our money and made fools of us. Surely you will give us justice." "Yes," echoed Lapierre stubbornly, "and the money was my own money, which I had made from the products of my farming." A month later Don Pedro Suarez de Moreno, Count de Tinoco, Marquis de la Dehesa, and Brigadier General of the Royal Armies of the Philippines and of Spain, sat at the bar of the General Sessions, twirling his mustache and uttering loud snorts of contempt while Lapierre and Madame Redon told their story to an almost incredulous yet sympathetic jury. But the real trial began only when he arose to take the witness chair in his own behalf. Apparently racked with pain, and laboring under the most frightful physical infirmities, the general, through an interpreter, introduced himself to the jury by all his titles, asserting that he had inherited his patents of nobility from the Prince of Arras, from whom he was descended, and that he was in very truth General-in-Chief of the armies of the King of Spain, General Secretary of War, and Custodian of the Royal Seal. He admitted telling the Lapierres that they were the heirs of $500 million, but he had himself honestly believed it. When he and the rest of them had discovered their common error, they had turned upon him and were now hounding him out of revenge. The courtly general was as distinguished as ever as he addressed the hard-headed jury of tradesmen before him. As what canaille he must have regarded them. What a position for the Count de Tinoco! Then two officers entered the courtroom bearing the famous trunk of the general. Between them, the top tray proved to contain thousands of railroad tickets. The prosecutor requested the defendant to explain their possession. "Ah!" exclaimed Moreno, twirling his mustaches, "when I was general under my King Don Carlos, in the 7 Years' War of '75 and also in Catalonia in '80. I issued these tickets to wounded soldiers for their return home. At the boundaries the Spanish tickets were exchanged for French tickets." He looked as if he really meant it. Then the prosecutor called his attention to the fact that most of them bore the date of 1891 and were printed in French, not in Spanish. The prisoner seemed greatly surprised and muttered under his breath vaguely about plots and conspiracies. Then he suddenly remembered that the tickets were a collection, made by his little son. Beneath the tickets were found sheaves of blank orders of nobility and blank commissions in the army of Spain, bearing what appeared to be the royal seal. These the general asserted that he had the right to confer, by proxy, for his King Don Carlos. Hundreds of other documents bearing various arms and crests lay interspersed among them. The prisoner drew himself up magnificently. "I was the General Secretary of War of my king," said he. "When I had to give orders to the generals under me, of whom I was the chief, I had the right to put thereon the royal imprint of Don Carlos. I was given all the papers incident to the granting of orders and grades in the army, and I had the seal of the king, the seal of the royal king. But, unfortunately for the prisoner, the seals upon the papers turned out to be the legitimate arms of Spain and not those of Don Carlos, and as a finale he ingenuously identified the seal of the mayor of Madrid as that of his royal king. Next came a selection of letters of nobility, sealed and signed in the name of Pope Leo XIII. These, he asserted, must have been placed there by his enemies. I am a soldier and a general of honor, and I never did any such trafficking," he cried grandly, when charged with selling bogus patents of nobility. He explained some of his correspondence with the Lapierres and his famous bill for $12,000 by saying that when he found out that the inheritance Tessie did not exist, he had conceived the idea of making a novel of the story, a fantastic history to be published in 4 languages simultaneously, and asserted solemnly that he had intended printing the whole 16 feet of bill as part of the romance. Then, to the undisguised horror of the unfortunate general, at a summons from the prosecutor, an elderly French woman arose in the audience and came to the bar. The general turned first pale, then purple. He hotly denied that he had married this lady in France 23 years ago. Name of a name. He had known her. Yes, certainly. But she was no wife of his, she had been only his servant. The other lady, the Hibernian, was his only wife. But the chickens had begun to come home to roost. The pointed mustaches drooped with an unmistakable look of dejection, and as he marched back to his seat, his shoulders no longer had the air of military distinction that one would expect in a general of a royal king. His head sank on his chest as his deserted wife took the stand against him, the wife whom he had imagined he would never see again. Anyone could have seen that Elizabeth de Moreno was a good woman. Her father's name, she said, was Nichod, and she had first met the prisoner 23 years ago in the village of Dock, in the department of the Tarn, where, in 1883, he had been convicted and sentenced for stealing bed linen from the hotel Kassam. She had remained faithful to him in spite of his disgrace, and had visited him daily in prison, bringing him milk and tobacco. On his liberation she had married him and they had gone to live in Bordeaux. For years they had lived in comfort, and she had borne him 8 children. He had never been to any war, and was neither a general nor, so far as she had known, a friend of Don Carlos. She had supposed that her husband held some position in connection with the inspection of railroads, but, in 1902, it had come out that he was in the business of selling counterfeit railroad tickets, and had employed a printer named Paul Cassignol to print great numbers of third-class tickets for the purpose of selling them to ignorant soldiers and artisans. Moreno had fled to America. She had then discovered that he had also made a practice of checking worthless baggage, stealing it himself and then presenting claims therefor against the railroad companies. She had been left without a sou, and the rascal had taken everything. She had a way with him, including even the locket containing the hair of her children. By the time she had finished her story, Moreno's courage had deserted him. The jury without hesitation returned a verdict of guilty, and the judge then and there sentenced the prisoner to a term at hard labor in state's prison. ************* Mais oui, grunts Lapierre, as the crow, with a final caw of contempt, alights in a poplar farther down the road. I don't blame the bird for laughing at me. But, after all, there is nothing to be ashamed of. Is one to be blamed that one is fooled? Hein. We are all made fools of once and again, and, as I said before, he would have deceived the devil himself. But perhaps things are better as they are. Money is the root of all evil. If I had an automobile, I should probably be thrown out and have my neck broken. But if MCO intends to take the next train for Bordeaux, it is as well that he should be starting